Welcome to the Natural Super Kids podcast, where you will discover practical strategies to inspire you to boost the health and nutrition of your kids. I'm Jessica Donovan, a qualified naturopath specialising in kids' health, and I want to make it as easy as possible for you to raise healthy and happy kids. Let's get into it. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Natural Super Kids podcast. It is lovely to have you listening in today. So we are in the midst of a series on environmental allergies. This has come about because it is that time of the year here in the Southern Hemisphere anyway. The springtime allergies are at their peak. And so over the last couple of weeks, we've talked about pollen and grasses and hay fever, those typical springtime allergies. And we also dove into dust mites. Now, today I want to talk about asthma, because asthma can be involved or can be exacerbated at this time of the year, where there are the pollens and the grasses, and dust mites can have a part to play in asthma as well. Now, I first want to start off this conversation about asthma with a story. This one really stays in my memory. So this was a client, a family friend actually, who bought their son. He was in his mid to late teens at the time. This was quite a few years ago when I was still seeing people face to face in my naturopathic clinic. And he was a very promising footballer. So he was quite serious about his football. He was sort of aiming big with his football. He showed a lot of promise, but his asthma was holding him back, especially as he had progressed to the kind of, higher sort of levels in football. And, he was getting out of breath really easily, although he had great skills, that the asthma and how that was affecting how he could play footy was a big concern to him, because this was sort of the big love of his life. And he'd had asthma from a very young child and, had relied on medication, inhalers, bronchodilators, all of those medicines that are often prescribed for asthma. And when he came to see me, we made some changes to his diet and also put him on some supplements, really addressing the things that we're going to be talking about today. He made some big changes to his diet. Remember, he was, in his mid to late teens. So that's a pretty difficult time to get people to make changes, to get those teenagers to make changes. But he was very motivated. And he found, cutting out certain things from his diet. For him, it was dairy and gluten, as well as making some changes. We worked on his gut health. We worked on his microbiome. We worked on some other sort of environmental triggers that were present. And the results were profound. His doctor couldn't believe it. He no longer needed to rely on his puffer and his asthma medication anymore. And he noticed a big difference. He wasn't completely compliant with the dietary changes. He was pretty good, but there were times that he would, sneak in a bit of dairy or gluten, and it would make the world of difference. He would have struggle breathing again with exertion, that chest tightness that is so common with asthma, the breathlessness, the wheezing would come back. So that was motivation enough for him to continue. So that was such an amazing, story, and he was able to continue playing footy. So that was such a good news story. So I wanted to share this because I know that there are sometimes hesitations about how natural stuff or naturopathy, how effective it can really be with these chronic conditions like asthma. And so there is definitely hope So I want to talk about some of the key points when it comes to asthma. So asthma is a chronic inflammatory condition, and it obviously affects the respiratory system. Now, asthma involves a lot of different immune cells, which lead to inflammation. And the inflammation causes recurrent episodes of wheezing, breathlessness, chest tightness, coughing, and the symptoms of asthma are usually worse at night and early in the morning. So although asthma is a respiratory condition, the key, as it is for a lot of the things that I talk about here on the podcast and a lot of the conditions and symptoms that we see commonly in kids, is that we need to address the underlying inflammation. If we can reduce the inflammation, like we did with the story I just told you, by removing certain things from the diet, for example, for every person it's different, where that source of inflammation is coming from. But addressing that underlying inflammation really makes such a difference to the severity of the symptoms that someone is going to experience in asthma. And another big part of looking at asthma naturopathically is working on gut health and the microbiome and also immune regulation. Because as we've been talking about in this environmental allergies series, basically with these, these different things that are triggering asthma, the immune system is it's overreactive. It's reacting to things that it shouldn't be often in asthma. The modern medical approach to asthma can include, there's a few different medications that are used commonly. Anti-allergic prophylactic inhalers work really well when there is when allergy is contributing to asthma symptoms, which it often is. Corticosteroid inhalers, which reduce that inflammation. Bronchodilator inhalers, which dilate the bronchioles so that the person can breathe better, as well as intravenous medications for acute attacks. But, many of these medications are working on that symptomatic relief. Like if you've got asthma symptoms, take this. Yes, there are some of those prophylactic inhalers that can work, but they're still not digging deep enough to address the underlying cause. Now, of course, medication is often needed in asthma, but what I'm talking about here today is things that you can do alongside the medication that will hopefully reduce the need for medication. But it's really important that to always talk to your GP or whoever it is that your child is under the care of, a pediatrician, before making any changes to medications that they might be taking. Genetics play a significant role in asthma, and children with eczema or allergies are at a higher risk of developing asthma. So this is known as the allergic march or the atopic march, and this is really an interesting sort of idea or progression. It describes the natural progression of allergic disease from infancy right through to adulthood. And it's really interesting to note that, babies are often the first sort of signs of allergic disease or atopic disease is eczema or rashes or hives, and this will often happen sort of between birth and 1 year, where babies will show signs of eczema. And look, this doesn't always lead to the next step, but it is a sign that this child is at a higher risk for developing further atopic or allergic conditions. Often that will step up from 1 to 3 years where food allergies, start to develop. Things like peanut allergies or tree nuts or cow's milk or egg or wheat, soy, fish, shellfish. These are the top 8 allergens. So eczema will often progress to food allergies, and then that will often then progress from to more seasonal and environmental allergies, including hay fever, allergic rhinitis, those things that we've been talking about. And then that will lead into asthma, around that sort of 5 to 7 year mark. It certainly can happen earlier, but asthma is often that last sort of step in the allergy march. So if you've got younger children that are showing signs of, eczema, skin irritation, hives, food allergies, hay fever, then some of the things that we're talking about today will be really helpful for you to know to help to prevent that sort of onset of asthma and definitely to reduce the symptoms as well. So as I illustrated in the story that I shared, diet and lifestyle and natural therapies can significantly reduce the symptoms of asthma. Another thing to note is that asthma is really difficult to diagnose under the age of 5 because there's so many other things that could be going on. So often asthma won't be diagnosed until 5 years old. And there are a lot of things that exacerbate asthma. So things like exercise, respiratory infections, exposure to cold or dry air pollutants such as tobacco, aerosols, perfumes, even like newsprint and diesel particles, fumes from chemical cleaning agents, gas stoves can all sort of exacerbate asthma symptoms as well. Meteorological changes in temperature and humidity, you often hear in the weather reports that it's a high risk day for asthma sufferers, stay indoors, even emotion and emotional behaviours that alter breathing, such as laughing or shouting or crying, can exacerbate asthma. And then reflux, it often exacerbates asthma symptoms as well. So there's a lot going on when it comes to asthma. So I want to start today by talking, in terms of what we can do about asthma. I want to start by talking about identifying and addressing environmental triggers and also dietary triggers, because these are, can really be at play too, as I sort of illustrated in the story that I told at the start of this podcast. One thing to note and is really important to remember is that inflammatory triggers are different for each person. So as I talked about removing gluten and dairy being really helpful for the client that I was talking about, that's not going to be the case for everyone. So seeking some support from a qualified practitioner, and this is certainly something we can help with here at Natural Super Kids, is really key to understand and start to uncover what the triggers of your child's asthma are. And so when it comes to environmental triggers, there are all sorts of things that can trigger asthma symptoms and contribute to asthma symptoms. Pet dander, dust mites, mold, which we're going to talk more about in next week's podcast episodes, pollens and grasses, which is why asthma sufferers often have an exacerbation of symptoms in the springtime when those pollens and grasses are at their highest. And as I said, things like tobacco and aerosols and fragrances and chemical cleaners and gas stoves can be big triggers for asthma sufferers as well. Now, over the last couple of weeks, we've talked about how to minimize exposure to dust mites. That was 2 weeks ago. And also how to reduce exposure to pollens and grasses. So go back and listen to those episodes for those tips. And next week, we're going to be talking about mold. So all of those episodes are going to be really handy for you to listen to if you have a child with asthma. You can get allergy testing done, pinprick allergy testing to determine what it is your child is, triggered by. But, there are also, certain sensitivities that can be present that won't come up on an allergy test. So just be aware of that. And I do also want to mention briefly that food triggers obviously can be at play here. Dairy is a big one, especially A1 casein. I have done a whole podcast episode on A1 versus A2 and whether your child may have an issue with dairy. I'll make sure I link that in the show notes so you can find that episode. Sulfites. So these are, food additives, preservatives that are added to food, can trigger asthma really commonly. So a practical little thing that is really helpful to know is that sulfites are labeled on food labels as E220 to E228. So anything in that range of 220 to 228 is a sulfite, and you want to avoid those food additives in kids with asthma. They're often found on dried fruit. So that's, a big one for kids, because kids tend to eat dried fruit or things with dried fruit in them. So, if you're buying muesli bars, for example, that have sultanas in them, more often than not, those sultanas are going to have sulfites. So be aware of those food additives especially in food that you commonly give your kids, and take notice, if you're not ready to eliminate them completely, take notice of whether asthma symptoms might increase after consumption of these sulfites in food. And also, to make it even more complex, naturally occurring food chemicals such as histamines and salicylates can trigger asthma symptoms as well. Wheat, gluten, corn, soy. Now, not all of these foods or environmental triggers are going to be problematic for every asthma sufferer, which is why it's really important to, uncover the particular triggers for your child. The other thing that is really helpful to know is that we want to really start to look at reducing that inflammation. As I said, inflammation, if the airways are inflamed, then that is going to lead to more asthma symptoms and, ultimately asthma attacks potentially as well. So inflammation is a key driver of asthma, and we want to reduce that inflammation where we can. So understanding what the particular triggers for your child is and avoiding those or minimizing exposure to those goes a long way in reducing inflammation. We can also do things like omega-3 can be really helpful for reducing inflammation and reducing the symptoms of asthma. So an omega-3 supplement can be really helpful for kids with asthma. Things like quercetin and bromelain are nutritional sort of compounds that can help to reduce inflammation. Bromelain is great. It has been shown to reduce inflammation and mucus associated with asthma. And quercetin is a bronchorelaxant, as well as being an anti-inflammatory. So they're just a couple of things that can help to reduce inflammation in children with asthma, and following an overall healthy diet that is sort of Mediterranean based. So lots of fresh fruits and vegetables, good quality protein, fish and seafood, nuts and seeds, olive oil. That is going to help to reduce overall inflammation levels as well. Reducing things like processed food, refined food, omega-6 oils, canola oil, vegetable oil, sunflower oil, those sorts of things. Processed refined food, sugar. These things are inflammatory in the diet, so they're going to promote more inflammation. Now, if you're a club member, we've got a lot of great resources to help you reduce inflammation. It's a big task, but we have, a reducing inflammation naturally cheat sheet that you might want to check out, which really lists the things that you can do to help reduce your child's overall inflammation, whether that's because of asthma, but also, things like eczema and other chronic conditions that we see commonly in kids have a big inflammatory component as well. If you're not a club member and you are interested in resources like this, then I'll pop the link to the wait list in the show notes. We are opening the doors in October 2023, if you're listening to this in real time, towards the end of October. So pop your name on the wait list so you'll be the first to know when we open the doors, and also you will get a VIP waitlist bonus offer as well. Now, while we're talking about inflammation, the other thing that is really important to know, and if you've been listening to this podcast for any length of time, you will know, I've talked about this before, is that the gut and an imbalance in the gut or compromised gut health can lead to a lot of inflammation. So dysbiosis, which is an imbalance of bacteria in the gut, and leaky gut or intestinal permeability, where food particles can leak through into the bloodstream before they've been fully broken down, are big contributors when it comes to inflammation in asthma. And so we want to make sure we are working on the gut as always. There's some really interesting, more and more interesting research being done about the gut-lung axis. So the lungs have their own microbiome. The gut microbiome impacts the lung microbiome, and there are specific strains of probiotic species that have been shown to support that gut-lung axis and reduce respiratory symptoms. It's just still blows my mind that, that work that we do on the gut always has these positive flow-on effects to the respiratory system, to the immune system, to allergic disease, and, even brain health, which we've talked about a lot before. So that your time is never wasted focusing on your child's gut health. And there are so many benefits when it comes to like the positive flow-on effects when we are optimizing the health of the gut. And so if you're, again, this is very individual, one child may have leaky gut that's contributing to their inflammation that's leading to an exacerbation in asthma symptoms, and another child may have an overgrowth of a particular, pathogenic bacteria in their microbiome that's leading to inflammation that's exacerbating asthma symptoms. So again, it is really important to be looking at your child individually, and we can certainly help with that in terms of practitioner support. But as a general few things that you can do to support your child's gut is to include more gut healing foods in the diet. Bone broth is great. You can add it to soups and casseroles and sauces. Gelatin gummies are great as well. So bone broth, one of the great benefits of bone broth is that it's really high in gelatin, which is healing to the gut. And so gelatin gummies are another way of getting that gelatin in. And fermented foods can be really helpful for optimizing the health of the gut. Coconut kefir, cashew cheese, sauerkraut, fermented veggies are great. Just a little note though, again, to make this a little bit more complicated, is that fermented foods are high in histamine. And you may remember that I said that histamine, or foods high in histamine, can be a trigger for some kids with asthma. So if you are finding that all of these gut goodness foods are making your child's asthma worse, that is a hint that histamine intolerance is at play. But most of the time, these, fermented foods and bone broths and things are going to be beneficial for supporting gut healing and function in kids, and reducing that big source of inflammation, which is a compromised gut. So as you can hear, there's a lot to unpack when it comes to asthma. I do also just want to mention one other helpful nutrient, and I've mentioned this over the last couple of weeks as well. It is vitamin D. Vitamin D is essential for immune regulation. It improves allergy tolerance, and it also improves microbiome diversity. And interestingly, the prevalence of asthma symptoms is correlated with vitamin D levels. So the lower a child's vitamin D levels, the higher their prevalence of asthma symptoms are. Studies have shown that. So making sure your child's vitamin D levels are optimal, and you can look at vitamin D levels via a blood test to see exactly how much they might need in terms of supplements, or may not need. Maybe their vitamin D levels are great. Vitamin D is obviously the sunshine nutrient, but a lot of kids do need additional supplementation, either because they're not spending enough time outside, because they have a higher need for vitamin D, because of the climate and the location that they're living in, because of race as well, and skin color that can really affect how much vitamin D is absorbed. So there's lots of factors that go into or that contribute to potentially needing some vitamin D supplementation to maintain good levels of vitamin D. Okay, so I really hope that has been helpful. This is, just really scratching the surface on asthma, but I hope you learned something new. I'd love to hear from you over on Instagram. Send us a DM or a message over on Natural Super Kids on Instagram, and let us know what you thought of this episode. And yeah, I'd love to know something new you learned. If you are wanting support with your child's asthma, please consider booking an appointment with one of our qualified practitioners. I'll pop the link in the show notes, and I'll also pop the link to our gut health ebook, which is a really handy resource to start so you can start optimizing your family's gut with some really great practical tips in there. Thanks so much for listening, and I will be back next week with our final episode in this environmental allergies series. We're going to be talking about mold. It is going to be a good one. See you then. Thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today. Head on over to our website, naturalsuperkids.com, for the show notes for this episode, as well as a whole heap of inspiration to help you raise healthy and happy kids. I'll see you next week.